Okay, welcome back to my model railroad. This is part 2 of the video on how I've been laying track. It's only been about a minute or two since the previous video ended, but so I'm going to continue the tutorial here on how I've been working on the track. So now you see here I have my soldering gun all set up, plugged in. Make sure you have a decent amount of slack on the cord because you will be having to move the soldering gun around the rails to make sure you're soldering at the right angle. I've got my resin core non-lead solder. You can see here I got this on Amazon. It's lead free. It's very, very thin. It's much, much neater than this electrical thicker solder that I ended up getting at my local hardware store. It's also lead free. Really, the key here was lead free. I don't know if there's any harm in breathing in any of the fumes or anything, but I just want to work with the lead free anyway, just to be safe. So I'm going to go solder these one at a time, and we'll take a look at each one as I do them. Okay, and you can see there the first one is done and it is cooling. It doesn't look too bad. Here, I need to make sure I don't touch the soldering gun. Done that before and it doesn't feel too good. Most important thing is just to make sure that there's no solder sticking up above the side of the rail. As you can see here, I did a pretty good job of making sure it's all flush with the top of the rail. My soldering has come a long way. This one actually looks pretty good. Let's give it a little tug to see if it's stuck. Yeah, I don't feel that rail moving. The top rail is moving, but that's okay. You can see here the bottom rail is not moving at all. That's good. I've definitely come a long way with my soldering. So here's one of the first ones I did, and I used that thicker solder I got from the hardware store, and you can see it just looks pretty awful. It's just a giant glob. I may go in and either try to melt some of that solder off or actually go ahead and just use a Dremel and try to grind that down. Another approach is, here's a look of part of my finished product that I did on my previous piece, and I ran into the issue here where, I think it was this one. Nope, sorry, it was this one. This one here with the feeder wires, where what happened is I was soldering the side of the rails right there. The feeder wire actually melted off and then detached from the powered rail joiner. So what I had to do in order to try to fix that was just kind of wedge the wire up against the rail joiner and heat it up as best as I could without melting any of the ties. Remember, none of the ties were in this area, and then try to reattach that wire. The approach I've been using now to try to alleviate that problem is to, I guess what's called tinning the head of the soldering iron, or the soldering gun, and just melting some solder on there, and then just kind of spreading the melted solder onto the rails themselves in the rail joiner. That seemed to work pretty well. Let me try the other side and make sure that my feeder wires stay attached. Okay, that one looks like it came out pretty good. It's still cooling, so we can test it in a second. One of the interesting problems with soldering on the back end of the layout here, closer to the wall, I didn't have it so much trouble here, but say on track 2, there really wasn't enough room to get the soldering gun into position here. You can see I'm hitting the wall, basically. And also, I'm a righty, and in order to kind of get behind the rail here, especially for how I have to lean over the table, I had to do this all lefty. So it's a little difficult for me. I haven't climbed on the table yet, but what I'm thinking I'm going to have to do for track 1, because that's a nice long track up against the wall, is I might either have to just solder the rails, closest to me on this side, or what I might actually have to do is solder the entire, multiple sections of track together first, and then just pre-position them onto the layout, because there's no way I'm going to be able to solder the back of that rail. I might be able to either maybe somehow glue it in place, or I don't know if it's possible for me to move the table away from the wall at this point. It's a little difficult. Got a lot of items stored underneath here, so we'll see, but that's my plan for right now, is to just probably join numerous sections. I think it's around 6 or 7, and just make one long straight piece of track and then set the track into position. I won't be able to power the rail joiners doing that approach, but that just might be the risk I have to take, because I really don't see how I'm going to be able to get back in there to do the work, unfortunately. Unless maybe I could somehow climb up a ladder and get in through the window? Probably not. So the next step that I would do is actually to take my multimeter here and to test continuity between the rails and also the powered feeder wires, or I'm sorry, what will be my powered feeder wires. So I turn this to, very, very low reading, a 200 ohm max scale. See if I can do this one-handed. Test on either side of the rail here, and you can see this reads 0 ohms, so that's good. And I will try testing the second one here, and reading between 0 and 0.1 ohms. That's good here. Give this a nice tug. As you can see here, these are not separating. That's good. And okay, so then now we are ready to start gluing or caulking down the two pieces of track that we put together. Okay, and one difficulty I notice is since I have not been soldering to the crossover, I just ran into a brand new problem. You can see here that based on where the feeder wires want to sit on the track itself, and so where they want to sit down to the table and onto the soldered rail joiners, I am now getting these gaps right here on this end of the track. Normally this would not happen because I would have soldered these connections and wouldn't be having this issue, but because I chose not to solder in this piece, now I'm getting these unsightly gaps, which I'm also worried will cause the train to bump too much. You can see I did get some of them over here. When I laid this section, I actually pinned down this piece first, ran both of these sections of track, and then tried to glue it all down or caulk it all down as one unit. It mostly worked. I haven't tested it. I have not cleaned it up yet. As you can see, I still do have a couple of gaps there, which I'm not too happy about, but I'm going to try seeing if I can at least alleviate some gaps here. So what I'm going to do now is actually go in and take my snap blade or my wire snips that I basically just use as cutters and see if I can just cut out a little bit of that cork so that way I can slide this rail in this direction. Okay, not too much luck there. So I think what I'm going to do, because you can still see there's some play in this, is when I caulk and then eventually T-pin this piece in place, I'm going to, angle the T-pin such they're providing just a little bit of force that way to push this section of track into this crossover. Now, before I get to the caulk, which is a very messy piece, a way of laying down the rails, what I want to do is talk about some of these ties that that we removed from the rails ahead of time. So as you can see here, these ones, they're connected. You can cut them so that they're two individual ties, and that'll be fine for, say, laying the ties underneath a section like this, where there's plenty of room under there. Where that doesn't work is here, where you have the feeder wires in place. So I've been using 2 or 3 different approaches to try to get this to work, and I want to discuss the pros and cons of both. So the first approach, you can see here, this is one of the first ones I did here, and I just came in and you can see these, you can even see these two are still together, and slid these two pieces under the rails. And unfortunately, you can see here the rail joiner is sits a little bit lower than the rest of the rails. So if you try to slide this plastic piece in place, what's going to happen is these rails are going to lift up slightly. So as you can see here, the rail between here, there's a little gap as it goes. You can see that little gap underneath. I might even be able to fit the blade through that gap. Let's see. Let's do it first and then show the video. Yeah, you can see I can even actually fit the snap blade through that gap. Now, the idea is that when I go back and eventually ballast the track, you won't see this. However, right now it's a little unsightly. Besides the fact the whole thing is a little sloppy, it's one of the first ones I did. Now let me show you an example of where I actually sanded the little channels for the rail joiner. So in this joint, you can see I'm all the way towards the second half of track 2. So this was after I probably already did, 8 pieces of track. I decided that what I would do is I would actually not only slice off those nibs from the rails, from the ties, but I would actually go ahead and sand and take my little jeweler's file and file the area down. You can see here there's even some discoloration of the plastic here, where you can kind of see where I had used the file. Mixed success here. It sort of worked. You can see it sits a little bit closer. That one actually looks pretty good. It was kind of a messy process, and I'm still not completely happy with it. You can see here the joint still looks like it's coming up a little bit right there. Now I'll show you, and then you can even see here how this whole track is actually up over the rail, the road bed here. Now what I'm hoping is that when I go ahead and ballast everything, you won't notice, but maybe you will. That also probably has to do with the fact that my tables aren't perfectly level, and this foam has some, have some bows in it as well. And I want to show you the third approach that I've been using. Let me find a good example. So this is the third example that I've been using of how to place these ties back in place. You can see here, this is a section with powered rail joiners. So I really don't have an option of just sliding the ties back in place because they'd hit these feeder wires. So what I actually did is I took the tie and I snipped them. I snipped off the little end nib on each end, and then I actually shortened the center part of the tie, and then I used my little hobby pliers to put a little bead of caulk on each one and put it into position, and using a T-pin I was able to kind of set each item in place. It is a little messy, as you can see here. It also does not look perfect. I'm hoping that when I go ahead and ballast this track later, you won't notice. However, the ballast might not do a good enough job hiding it, and these ones might just always look terrible, and might have to redo them. You can actually just buy these sections. The ties if you want. I also figured I could probably just buy one more piece of flex track and have enough ties left over to do pretty much my whole layout if I wanted to. So the approach that I'm going to use for the first one right by the crossing is to just try to slide the ties underneath, and then by the rail joiners, powered rail joiners, we won't have much of a choice other than to use this approach, especially right next to the wire, say, depending on where the tie has to be spaced. So I'm going to call this quits on this particular video because I'm already up to 11 minutes. And on part 3, I'll show you how to caulk down the track and also T-pin it in place and place some weights so that way the track won't move. Thank you very much. See you next time.